Great. Well, thank you all for joining for the LMF Virtual Action Hour. My name is Luke Frankel. I'm the Woods, Waters, and Wildlife Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. And we're presenting this presentation on behalf of the LMF, the Land for Maine's Future Coalition. And we're going to present to you, give a little background about, I guess I can fast forward to the agenda here. We're going to give an overview of the Land for Maine's Future program. Specifically, we're joined by colleagues from several organizations on the call here today. The Trust for Public Land, the Appalachian Mountain Club, Maine Farmland Trust, and Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And so each of those programs kind of represent distinct elements of the program. And so those four elements, the conservation and recreation, public access to Maine waters, working waterfront protection, and working farmland protection. Those are our colleagues are going to kind of go through talk about those specific aspects of the program and highlight some examples. And then we're also going to provide an update on what the current status is of funding the program in the State House, and then describe what you can do to take action before kind of diving into some Q&A at the end there. So just to start and give an overview of the Land for Maine's Future program, the program was created in 1987 because Mainers were losing recreational access. So it started with a bond that funded the program, and the program has kind of evolved through the years to address different emerging concerns as development pressures have changed through the years. And the program has been really successful at protecting some of Maine's most beloved places, and you're going to hear a lot of examples today of various properties that LMF has protected, and it has protected properties in all 16 counties. So I'm sure there's a couple of sites located pretty close to where you're from here in Maine. And then additionally, it helps communities and wildlife become more resilient to climate change. Land conservation, is one of the more fundamental things we can do to protect the environment. And LMF has been kind of a core component of land conservation in Maine for multiple decades. And as I mentioned, LMF does help us address climate change. So a lot of you are probably familiar with Maine's Climate Action Plan, also called Maine Won't Wait. And that plan establishes the goal of conserving 30% of the land of natural and working lands in Maine by 2030. But currently, we're only at about 22.5% of Maine conserved, and we've only really added 2.25% since 2020. So we have a long way to go to meet that 30 by 30 goal. And so the plan actually specifically calls for a sustained funding of LMF in order to achieve that goal. But since the fund's running out of money, it's really essential that there's an immediate need. And so in order to hit this goal, we really need an LMF program that's funded, and currently it's out of funding. And so now just to dive into some nuts and bolts of the program, just to familiarize you with why it's so popular. All LMF funds require a one-to-one match. So what this means is when LMF submits a request for proposals, land trusts, other entities, municipalities can apply for grants. And if they're looking to purchase a property or a parcel of land for $200,000, that means the program would contribute about $100,000, and then the entity who's applying for the grant through LMF will also have to contribute at least $100,000 in that specific example. So this helps incentivize private investment in land conservation. And then most of the lands conserved through LMF actually remain on the tax rolls with either land trusts who purchase or purchase land or purchase conservation easements through LMF. And that land, generally, they either continue paying taxes on that land or make payments in lieu of taxes. And so 97.8% of lands that are owned by land trusts in Maine continue to either pay taxes or make payments in lieu of taxes. And these LMF projects are all community driven, only occurring between willing sellers and willing buyers. And in a lot of cases, municipalities are actually required to approve these LMF projects in some cases. So projects really only land in the communities where they're really wanted. And the LMF scoring system is designed to balance kind of rural and urban areas to make sure that there's an even distribution of these projects across the state. And so here's a map on the right that kind of shows all the projects. As you can see, they're scattered throughout all 16 counties in the state. And as I mentioned earlier on, there are four different project types within LMF. There's conservation recreation, which are kind of shown in the, it's a little small, but are shown in the green colors. Farmland projects shown in yellow with a lot of projects in southern and central Maine. Water access sites shown in the turquoise blue color. And then the working waterfront, which you can see are kind of scattered up the coast. You're going to hear more about them. So there's 75 recreational water access sites, 45 farms totaling 10,000 acres. Um, um, and then 33 working waterfronts from York all the way to Eastport, so spanning the whole coast. And then 1,272 miles of shorelands protected and over 158 miles of former rail corridors turned into recreational trails and over 333,000 acres of private working forest land. So that's another big component of the program. So it really helps incentivize and support local industries, including forestry, for some of the projects. And then in total, the program has conserved more than 650,000 acres. So it's had a pretty substantial impact across the state. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at the Trust for Public Land to talk more about the Conservation and Recreation Program.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Hey, everyone. Lynette Batt. I'm a project manager at the Trust for Public Land, so I manage land conservation projects. Luke, that was an awesome overview. I learned a lot, so I always love when I learn a lot more about LMF. So Land for Maine's Future is a critical program for all conservation in Maine. I think everyone on this call probably knows that, and I just want to thank you all so much for showing up and being interested in representing LMF and supporting getting this refunded. So I wanted to just talk really quickly about the Conservation and Recreation Program of LMF. That's one of the larger funding programs within LMF. And as Luke just mentioned, there's been a tremendous diversity of projects since 1987. So I just listed on the slide here some of the iconic projects that many people on this call will recognize. And then I put in orange projects that were completed or led by Trust for Public Land. And I'll talk about a couple of those in a second. But if you don't see your iconic LMF site on this slide, it's certainly in the list of 275 plus projects that you can find for Land for Maine's Future. And I just want to encourage everyone, if you get a chance to go on the map, Land for Maine's Future, you just Google LMF map in Maine. There's a fantastic map and you can just cruise around and see what sites have been funded. And then one thing I'll call out in the slide is 6 community forests. So really kind of a diversity of different conservation and recreation types of projects, but the community forests really hit that balance and are typically really focused at public access and different types of recreation. Next slide. Okay, so here were 4 projects. These are all Trust for Public Land projects that I wanted to just show as examples. This is kind of the spread of different conservation and recreation projects. So Tumbledown Mountain, Mount Blue State Park, that was a huge project, about 26,000 acres, which was a combination of fee acquisition, which means just buying the land the same way you or I would purchase land, and conservation easements. So that was completed about 25 years ago now, around 2001, between 2001 and 2003. So really awesome project with a lot of partners. All of these projects are partnership projects. Another one was Crocker Mountain. And someone I think in the chat mentioned Mount Abraham. So those were 2 kind of paired projects, but Crocker Mountain was about 12,000 acres, completed in 2013. And both of those went to Maine Bureau of Parks and Lands as the ultimate owner. Another one that isn't as iconic, but just kind of shows the spread of LMF projects was called the Central Maine Sportsman Access Project. And that became a wildlife management area owned by the Maine Department of Inland Fish and Wildlife. So that's all about sportsman access for hunting, fishing, and all that. So that was completed in 2015. And the last is an example, community forest. So this was one of my projects I completed with Inland Woods and Trails and the Northern Forest Center were the partners on that. It was about 450-acre community forest, closed just a couple of years ago. And I will pause there and turn it over to my colleague, Eliza Townsend with the Appalachian Mountain Club.
Thanks, Lynette. I am, as you said, Eliza Townsend. I'm the Maine Conservation Policy Director for the Appalachian Mountain Club, and really appreciate your joining us today and your interest in the Land for Maine's Future program. One of the sub-programs is the Public Access to Maine Waters Fund. And as you saw on Luke's fabulous map, LMF has conserved 75 projects statewide specifically for water access. And that's because we all need and deserve access to the water, especially as summers get hotter. We need a place to cool off, and not everyone has one. Water access drives our tourism and our outdoor recreation economy, worth $9 billion and $3.5 billion annually, respectively. And waterfront property is desirable. So it's increasingly out of reach for many of us. It is more and more expensive and harder for the rest of us to get water access. To illustrate that point, I shared a photograph of one of my favorite places, Lake George Regional Park in Canaan, my hometown. And I chose it because when I was a kid, this little beach that you see was owned by an elite summer camp serving wealthy families from out of state. And folks who lived in Canaan did not have water access. If you had choices of, you could own your own summer camp on a pond somewhere if you could afford it. You could drive some distance for water access, or you could park by the side of the road and use this tiny little spot we referred to as the swimming hole. But when the camp was up for sale, the local community was able to work with the state of Maine to acquire that land for access for local folks, which has resulted in swimming lessons. It's just a terrific example, I think. So on my next slide, we have a couple of other examples. And the two more traditional ones from Gardner, from the Public Access to Maine Waters Fund are Gardner Landing in Gardner in Kennebec County, which is 1.9 acres. It's a waterfront park and boat launch, and as you see, gives access to the Kennebec River. And on the right, one that is a little more unusual is a LMF project in Scarborough, which created access to Higgins Beach. And what is interesting, I think, about it is that it is 1.5 acres and it's not on the water itself. It's a parking lot. And if you've ever been to a beach town, you know what a struggle it can be to find parking. Higgins is an exceedingly popular beach, especially for surfing. And so that parking lot means that Mainers are able to get to the beach. And of course, that is the dedicated fund, but water access is so often embedded in the more traditional large-scale conservation projects. And so I couldn't help myself. I threw in a photograph here of the West Branch of the Pleasant River, which sits within property owned by the Appalachian Mountain Club. And it was part of a 37,000 acre purchase back in 2003. So I will pass now to my colleague at the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And thanks for coming.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emerson Goodrich. I'm a project manager at Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. I work primarily in our Working Waterfront program. So the Working Waterfront Access Protection Program comes up a lot as we're talking about trying to keep our waterfront in Maine working. As we all probably know, working waterfronts are quintessential to Maine's identity and economy, but are acutely vulnerable to loss. This happens usually through damage, so as we saw in the 2024 storms, and through conversion, so development pressure, and properties turning over to uses that aren't compatible with fishing uses. This is where the Working Waterfront Access Protection Program comes in. So one of the great things about this program is that it serves all types of working waterfront. So this can include ones owned or acquired by municipalities. There's been some great nonprofits and foundations that have, sprung up all along the coast trying to protect these sites. And this can range to fishing and aquaculture co-ops and businesses and individuals as well. And those last few, the privately owned ones, are especially important in the context of this program because even though there's been some really great momentum around conserving working waterfront, there are actually really not that many programs available to privately owned working waterfronts to help protect them. So this one is huge in helping people either retain access, navigate changes in ownership, or repair damage done from storms. As Eliza mentioned too, something we don't often think about are some of these like services that support access. So some examples are, obviously the wharves that we love to see, but also some things behind the scenes that provide critical services to keep working waterfronts working, like parking lots. And a little bit about how it helps because I think maybe it's different than in the land conservation world. So there are covenants that are placed on these properties. So that restricts, development and other uses that aren't compatible with commercial fishing. And through the sale of the development rights, often those funds are reinvested in the property. So that can support funding gaps when ownership changes, like often to keep it working, which provides great continuity for fishermen who are actively using these sites. And it's also critical in repairing properties. So storm damage can cause huge amounts, a huge expense for individuals often. So this is a great way to bridge that gap or even just provide upgrades that would help serve more fishermen, increase capacity, all of that. We can go to the next slide so I can show you some of the awesome places that have been enrolled in this program. One of them is Holbrook's Wharf, and Holbrook's Community Foundation sprung up to protect this site. This is located in Harpswell and was actually the first site included in the program. And their mission is around preserving Maine's fishing heritage and doing education and supporting the next generation. There's Vinyl Haven Co-op, so that's a fisherman's co-op on Vinyl Haven. Moosebeck Mussel up in Jonesport, so that's a business. And then pretty recently, Carter's Wharf, which used to be Sea Pier in the Boothbay Harbor, that was protected by the Boothbay Region Maritime Foundation, and Luke's Lobster operates out of there. And there's also so many that have been protected that are under individual ownership, that are so critical to keeping access for fishermen in Maine's towns. And I just want to highlight too, all of these, businesses, foundations, wharves support delivering sustainable seafood to Maine residents, and are permanently protected to support the next generation of fishermen. So it would be devastating to not have funding for this program for so many working waterfronts that we want to keep saving. And now I will pause and pass it to Shelley at Maine Farmland Trust.
Thank you so much, Emerson. And thank you everyone for being here today to learn more about the Land for Maine's Future program and to support it. We really need that support so we can get more funding and really durable funding for this program. So I am Shelley McGuire. I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust, and wanted to share a bit with you all about working farmland protection. You'll hear a lot of kind of similar themes to what Emerson was just sharing in terms of working waterfront access. One of the things that I want to start out by highlighting is just the sad reality that we're losing farmland in our state at a really alarming rate. We've lost 230,000 acres in the decade that preceded the most recent ag census, which was done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 2022. So between 2012 and 2022, we lost over 200,000 acres of farmland. Working farmland protection through an agricultural conservation easement like those that are funded through the Land for Maine's Future program is a really important strategy to slow this loss of farmland. An ag conservation easement is essentially a voluntary, permanent restriction on the landowner's development rights over a property. So it's something that the landowner chooses to put on their privately owned property. And it prevents subdivision and non-agricultural development, but allows for continued agricultural use. So these are designed to be highly flexible easements. There is often compensation for the landowner if it is a purchased easement. And because of that, these are tools that can really help to facilitate farmland access, because it can lower the purchasing price for a farm in such a way that then an incoming farmer can then afford the property. So a really important tool in farmland transfer, in succession planning, and in farmland access. And just to reiterate, the property does remain in private ownership and on tax rolls. So you can go to the next slide, and I want to share just one example of a recent LMF funded project with you all. This is a picture from Ward Farm in Thorndike. I'm based in Belfast, so this is a nearby farm for me. And we completed this project with support from the Land for Maine's Future program in 2025. The project was 415 acres covered by the conservation easement. That's a mixture of agricultural soils and that are open for agriculture and forested land. And what was really interesting was that this project was done through a succession plan between two different commercial agricultural operations. So a retiring conventional dairy and then a local veggie farmer who was looking to expand their property and was able to do that through this program. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to a Facebook post that Maine Farmland Trust put out, so you can actually see the faces of the farmers and hear a little bit more about the story or read a little bit more about the story there. But I think through all of our presentations, one of the things that, for me is kind of a through line is talking about land, but also talking about people, right? Like people are at the heart of the LMF program, whether that be fisher people, whether that be farmers, whether that be local residents looking to access green space. So as we all advocate for funding for this program, I think if we can just keep like people on the land at the forefront of our messaging, then that, to me, it really resonates with policymakers. So happy to answer questions in the Q&A portion, but I will pause there and pass it back to Luke to close us out.
Great, thank you so much, Shelley. Those were all great presentations, very very insightful. I also learned a bunch there too, which is awesome. So now to kind of give a little bit of update of where things stand in the State House. So as you have heard from several of us here today, the LMF program is essentially out of funding as it currently stands. So there's a real urgent need to fund the program. A lot of our organizations have made this a top priority issue. For this legislative session. So you probably have heard a lot about that. And so there are multiple vehicles in play this session to fund the program. There's a bond for $50 million. That's LD 362, and that is currently in the Appropriation and Financial Affairs Committee, the AFA committee. There's also a budget allocation for $10 million per year, and that's LD 593. And that was passed unanimously out of the ACF committee and passed the House and Senate last year and is actually on the appropriations table. And then there's also this other bill, which is kind of a creative funding solution, and that's LD 1312, which takes a portion of the interest on the rainy day fund and then essentially directs that towards the Lands for Maine Future program. So that would kind of be, the other two are kind of have a time horizon of funding. The rainy day fund option is actually would be an ongoing revenue stream for the LMF program. And then finally, there's also the supplemental budget process is something that's happening. In the original draft of the governor's budget proposal, there wasn't funding for LMF, but in the hearing, there was a hearing this past Friday. That was a joint hearing where they were going over the items in the budget for the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, where the LMF program sits under. That's where it sits under in the state government. And at that meeting, an amendment to the budget was brought forward that actually incorporates some of the elements from LD 1312 into the budget. And so that will take 25% of the interest accrued on the rainy day fund and direct it to the LMF program. And so each of the funding mechanisms has its pros and cons. A bond would require a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate, and then also needs to be approved by voters in the following this upcoming November. So that is a pretty tall order. So kind of with all these options on the table, the one that I think a lot of our organizations view as the most feasible and the highest likelihood of success is incorporating in the supplemental budget, as was kind of presented on Friday. So we'll be advocating for that going forward. And now we can kind of dig into some of the nuts and bolts of how you can take action to help support that effort going forward. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Emmie Theberge, who at NRCM to kind of outline those steps.
Great. Thanks, Luke, and thanks everybody for being here. So as Luke mentioned, now is actually like a really great time for all of you to think about the ways in which you can support LMF and getting it funded this session. Two things that we wanted to lift up for you all is the option to draft and submit testimony to the Appropriations Committee in support of funding LMF. And the second is that the LMF Coalition, is hosting a really big day of action at the State House next week on Thursday, March 12th, where we'd love to pack the halls and show support for LMF. So I'll dig into these two things a little bit now. So the first thing is drafting testimony. Because this issue is really going to be decided by the Appropriations Committee, it's a little bit harder to engage directly with your legislator unless they happen to be on the Appropriations Committee. So we were thinking anybody in the whole state can submit testimony. And so this is something that people can do regardless of where you live and who your legislators are. So we have some tips for how to draft effective testimony. The first is obviously to have an introduction. You address the committee, you say who you are, where you're from, and any relevant affiliations that you may have. It's always really important to make it personal. So what Shelley mentioned about how LMF is really about people and it's about these stories, trying to have a personal connection to LMF will really stand out more in your testimony if you share that with legislators. So you could mention your favorite spot or why LMF matters so much to you. Then a little bit of details is still important. So showing that you are tracking this issue, that you're aware of, how LMF needs to be funded, that it's essentially out of money, why the legislature needs to act this session is an important part of that testimony. And then giving examples of how it's been successful in the past and why we need to continue to fund the program now. And then obviously in a closing, it's good to, again, ask for the thing that you want them to do, which is to fund LMF. Next slide. So we will be back in touch because this issue is really happening right now. As Luke mentioned, there is a mention of it just on Friday. We know that there's going to be hearings over the next few weeks on this. We will send you an email with more specifics in terms of like the LD number, or if there's any other things that you should reference in your testimony. But you can submit your testimony online anytime. We'll follow up in the email with all of these links so you don't have to scribble them down now. But there's a link that you can go to on the legislature's website. On the right there, it sort of shows what it will look like when you go to that web page. You'll need to know which committee, the date of the hearing, and the bill number. So we know that it's at the Appropriations Committee, so you can already find that. The date is likely to be determined. We'll give you more specifics as to the exact public hearing date that we think that this issue will come up. And we're pretty sure that the LD will be 22-112, which is the supplemental appropriations bill. So you can kind of see I tried to take some screenshots of the legislative website so you could see what it looks like. But again, we'll follow up with more information in an email so you know exactly how to submit this. Next slide, please. So as I said, we can help. Any one of our organizations would be more than happy to help you with talking points, reviewing your testimony, certainly being in touch about the specifics of the date and the public hearing to select, or any other questions that you may have. So we'll send a follow-up email with a lot of this, but if anyone wants to be in touch, just email me back and I'm happy to follow up with you directly. Next slide. All right, so the second thing you could do, you can submit testimony, and then if you want to come to the State House, we really encourage you to come next week, next Thursday, March 12th. We're having a really big day of action. So there'll be people from across the state, from across our organizations showing up at the State House from 8:30 to 12 in the halls of the State House, showing our support for LMF. Next slide. You can register online. You can take a picture of this right now and use that QR code, or again, we'll follow up with an email with all this information. The rough schedule of the day is showing up at 8:30, checking in at the Welcome Center at the State House, which is the room right after you go through security. We will have these really nice green LMF t-shirts for the first 100 people who show up. And that's part of our visibility in the State House to show that we're all there together to support LMF. So we'll go up to the 3rd floor of the State House, which is where the House and the Senate are. And we'll have some signs that you can have, or you're welcome to make your own poster, and really just be there together for a couple of hours trying to draw attention from legislators. We'll take a group photo, and there'll be other ways that you can engage on that day. So really hope that you can come, fill your car with friends and neighbors and other people who might want to join you at the State House. Next slide. Oh, that's it. So thanks for joining us. We're really happy to take any questions. If you have questions about the program or you have questions about how to submit testimony, we're happy to take those now.
I loved your outline of things to do, Emmie, and I wanted to throw one more in there, which is you can tell your own local legislators, even if they're not on the Appropriations Committee, how important this program is to you. And you could get a range of responses. They might say, great, I love it too. And then which case you can say, super, why don't you talk to your leadership and to members of the Appropriations Committee and let them know how important this is to you. If you don't hear positively from them, at least you will have made your point. And if they don't know about Land for Maine's future, it's time they did. So we'll find out that we need to tell them a little bit more.
Thanks, Eliza. And Amy, I just saw your message, which I think to me about the presentation. We will be sending a link. Yes, this is being recorded, so we'll send a link around in that email, which will probably go out tomorrow. So you'll get that then.
Going to the State House, I went to testify about, I think it was LD 362 last year. And what I thought was super cool about that is I got to hear a ton of people's personal connections to LMF lands that, I don't know, there were just residents who came and talked for, a bit about what was so special about the LMF land in their town, or that they like visiting. So I thought that was really awesome and a super worthwhile experience in terms of going and testifying or just kind of connecting with other people who care about this.
Great. How many folks think that they might have time in the next week or two to draft testimony? Does that feel like an activity that is exciting, doable? We're happy to, we do have time, so happy to workshop that with anybody thinking about what your story might be or why you care about LMF. And if you need to think on it, that's okay too. Just know that we're all a resource. So as you're considering what you might write, it doesn't have to be long. It really doesn't have to take a lot of time. It can be from the heart. The most important things are just that who you are, a little bit about why you care, and then what you want them to do, which is to fund LMF this session. And it's kind of as simple as that. All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions or if people aren't feeling super chatty, then we can also sign off. But I don't want to cut anybody off if there's something that someone's waiting to ask or to share.
Emmie, I'll just throw out, if everyone on this call brings one friend to the day of action, we're a third of the way there to the first 100 free green t-shirts. So I have put out a call to friends and family locally. I think that's really a good way to go. Get your friends and family that hike, bike, ski, whatever it is on LMF lands and have them just write testimony. So I've already got 4 or 5 people within my friends and family group that are going to be writing or showing up that day. So
That's
our
awesome.
own small networks can do a lot.
Yes, great point.
Emmie, I just might add, for any folks in the Franklin County region who might be interested in attending the Day of Action, but maybe transportation is an issue, we hosted an event last week in Kingfield, and we talked about this. And Mark Edwards, who is formerly in my role for NRCM, he has graciously offered to carpool and bring folks in his vehicle from Farmington to the State House that day. So if there's anybody who's interested in carpooling with Mark in the Franklin County area, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat here, and then I can help coordinate that for you.
Thanks, Olivia. And Pat just posted a comment. When writing testimony, it's helpful to know what opposing comments may be. Does anyone want to share insights to that and what we, just for maybe awareness or how you might address that if that comes up?
Yeah, I can start, and then others can also add if they want. The biggest thing we hear from lawmakers is kind of it's a general theme around conservation land in general is that, and I kind of tried to address it in one of my talking points that I shared today is that you're taking money off the tax rolls is a big thing. So I think having that number that or the knowledge and the point of the vast majority of land held by land trust continue either paying taxes or making payments in lieu of taxes is a big talking point. And another kind of similar fact was at the hearing last week. One of the appropriations and the members of the AFA committee was talking about how the state was, as part of the budget, was saying how they're having a tough time funding the management of the public lands that the state currently owns, the lands owned by BPL, all the state parks. And one of the points that he was like, why are we trying to conserve more land if we can't protect the land that we already have, or manage it appropriately with the funds that we have? And the point is that LMF, actually a lot of the land is held by private entities, land trusts, and so they're actually the ones who bear that management cost. That if that conservation land was owned by the state, it would be taxpayer dollars that deal with the maintenance of that land. So in a way, the LMF land that is protected by private entities like land trusts, that the maintenance, it's really, those lands are open for access in perpetuity. They're a public benefit, but it's really private organizations that kind of take on the burden. And so that saves taxpayer dollars. So it's a really, and the one-to-one match really helps ensure that there's private investment in land conservation and just saves a lot of money down the road. Does anyone else want to jump into that?
I'll add one concern we hear is more just a general concern of locking land up when it goes into conservation. So land that isn't public or part of state reserve lands or game lands that goes into private land trusts is almost always open to the public for multiple uses. So hunting, fishing is almost always allowed. I don't have a number, but I'd say upwards of 95% of conserved land is open to multiple uses and traditional uses. A lot of times existing, like one of the priorities of the program is multiple types of recreation. So keeping in place existing motorized corridors can also be a sensitive subject, snowmobiles and ATVs. So, I could cite off 5 projects right now that we've protected motorized snowmobile and ATV corridors on Land for Maine's future projects. So those are a couple of others.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Lynette, access to the land was the original whole point of LMF. Now, do we want should members of the public have access to every area of the farm? Of course not. But public access is fundamentally the point.
And is required by the program.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, as Luke pointed out, and as you have reiterated, by far the vast majority of the lands are open for hunting and fishing, and that's why this is supported by the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, as well as other related entities. What we tend to hear more than anything isn't so much opposition as, well, can we afford it? If we have the money? And that's why we're here today, is to ask you to be a voice, to make legislators aware that there is strong public support for choosing to afford this program, which contributes to our economy and to our way of life and to the reasons that we live here and to the reasons that people visit. Also,
add to that, one thing we hear from folks, particularly in Western Maine, but probably across the state is it needed? Like, we don't want anything to change. Do you really need to come and conserve the land? And my answer to that, so I grew up in Farmington and, throughout the 90s and moved back a few years ago. So I was gone for 20 years and see a significant change in a lot of cases of access. And sometimes, it's a small change and sometimes it's a big change, but we're seeing sort of unprecedented levels of turnover of land and transfer of land ownership from what used to be pretty consistent large ownership by large timberland companies. So that's getting chunked up a little bit more. And it only takes one landowner to shut down, 100 feet of a ITS segment, and then that trail is disconnected. So I think we are seeing the need for things to be more formally protected than it has been historically in order to keep those traditional uses.
Exactly. Access to the coast has been a struggle for decades. We're now seeing those same tensions erupting in places that we never thought we would see them in the Maine woods. There was a very high profile news case in the New York Times about Burnt Jacket Mountain in Beaver Cove, where people have used the trails and enjoyed the access for a long, long time. And now it's been turned into a wealthy seasonal home. It's closed off. That's the end of that for the locals.
Well, thank you, everybody. Any other questions or comments? Great. That's great, Amy. Well, we look forward to seeing you there. All right. Well, I hope you all have a good day, and we'll be in touch via email tomorrow with the recording and resources for how you can draft testimony and also more information about the action day on Thursday, next Thursday.